Now, are there any questions or comments about what we're doing? Anybody? Yes, sir. Yes, Colonel.
Mr. Stuart, was there any kind of reason for the Russian would have a fleet in the Baltic Sea?
Oh, yes. They've been, since Peter the Great, they've been trying to get their fleet out of, the Turks occupied the Crimea at that time, but Peter drove them out. Most of the Turkish holdings were lost in the Crimea during that 17th century, and certainly in the 18th century when Catherine the Great finished them off and added the Crimea to the empire. And then, of course, they had a fleet in the Baltic, and they wanted to begin trading, and they wanted the military defense that would provide against Europeans and against the Turks. The Russians fought the Turks all through the 19th, obviously they were still fighting in the 1850s. So, as I said, the English and the French did not want this competition. They certainly didn't want a military fleet in the Mediterranean, and they've never had one. So, but now they have merchant ships, of course. That was it. Yes, ma'am.
Were Catherine the Great and Victoria related? I know Catherine the Great also came from a German.
Yes, but the Coburgers and the Prussians were not exactly blood relations. They were different principalities. Hanover was the origin of Victoria's family, going back here. They were intermarried in that cousins married across borders and so on. When Victoria became ruler of England, one of her daughters, her granddaughter, I should say, became the Empress of Russia. This was the last Empress of Russia, was her granddaughter. So there's a link there, direct link in intermarriage, but there was no bloodline, not a close bloodline. I'm sure that you could find blood linkages if you went through all of the outer reaches of these genealogical trees. One last comment or question, and then we'll, yes, sir?
A lot of history in Scotland and in Ireland. Are you planning at any time?
Oh, I'd love to do something with, I wanted to do William Wilson. Wasn't that the one I'm thinking of? Wallace, thank you. I thought he'd be a marvelous character. Of course, then I found out that the kilt was a garment that was developed much later in history, which was sort of took the interest out of it because they all looked like Norman hooligans back in William Wallace's time. He was such an interesting character, and his end was so awful. And there were characters all through, Robert the Bruce, and any manner of characters that would make interesting storytelling. Ireland too, the Earl of Tyrone, and just full of colorful characters. And I'd love to do it, but I haven't. If you'll come up with one or two from each side that you research carefully for me so I don't have to go out and figure out how big their feet were and things like that, I'll be glad to attempt something.
You would have to do the figures first before you would attempt to do a lecture?
Oh yeah, it always goes to the body first. Yeah, and that means you research the anatomy of the creature as thoroughly as one is capable of doing. You can do much more now on the internet. I found out Mr. Becker introduced me to the internet, and it's like the monkey making the Bible with a typewriter. I hadn't a clue, but he went right over and found some obscure thing that it would have taken me months to do in the 1960s. He's just bing, 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 and there it was. All kinds of information. Some of it was actually accurate. But if you want to do a little research, I'd be interested. I'm working on something. 1862 came around. The Queen's seclusion deepened. She was not about to expose herself to the public. But as with most married couples, she and her husband had had plans for their children. And one of the plans, most urgent at the time of Albert's death, was the marriage of the Prince of Wales. This had been several months in the planning because, fortunately, Bertie had met a princess that he'd fallen in love with. So he did want to marry, and it was a love match, and she was Alexandra of Denmark, King Christian IX's daughter. They were betrothed, but then Albert died, and that put everything off. And now Victoria felt that she had to go ahead with it. She delayed it too long. So the marriage was planned, and again it would take place at Windsor. When the day came, of course, it was royals and notables from all over the country were there to see the young couple off. And of course, they also wanted to see Queen Victoria, who had been out of sight. The ceremony began, the bride and groom at the altar, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the whole thing began, but there was no queen. Where was the queen? They couldn't see her anywhere. Well, around the narthex of the altar, up high, were a gallery of alcoves. And sitting in one of them with a curtain was the queen, just barely in sight. You had to be way over here to see her. Well, as the ceremony began, got into it, and then suddenly there was sniffling. What's that? Oh my God, it's the Queen. She's weeping. The Queen's weeping. Well, the curtain went over them. The ceremony stopped. They would wait till the Queen got control of herself. Pretty soon the little curtain went back, and they began again. Do you ever have a long ceremony? Blah, blah, blah. Oh, dear. Curtain went over. They waited, and the curtain went back. Oh, it was picking up, you know. Well, pretty soon everybody was looking up there at this. They were transfixed. The little curtain would go. It was a Punch and Judy show while the Queen wept, and then she'd get control, and then they'd hurry up and get through more of the ceremony, and everybody was looking up there. Where's the ring? She just stole the show completely. She was weeping not for her son, but because Albert wasn't there. You know that. No. Public grumbling over her invisibility increased. She decided to spend more and more time at Osborne, which is their favorite home, and that was really a retreat. But she was deteriorating. Her family worried about her. They'd come out and visit her, and there she was gaining weight, and she sat by the window staring out the window all the time. She didn't do anything, didn't have any interests, just moping and mourning. So I thought, well, I've got to do something. She's going to die of inertia. So somebody said, well, let's bring some of the horse traps down from Balmoral, because she was a good equestrian. She had been anyway. And she'd get some exercise. So they had the head gillie bring down the pony carts and some horses. Well, the head gillie was John Brown. He'd been appointed by Albert. And of course, Victoria knew him. Everybody in the household knew him. So he was in his late 30s. He came down. As the Queen, one day, she went to sit by the window, and she looked out, and she said, oh, look. Her maid, look over here. That's Brown, isn't it? Yes, ma'am. Oh, Brown. We'll have him come up. So Brown came up. Ah, woman, you look peaked. What's the matter with you? You need exercise, ma'am. Oh, well, Mr. Brown, really? Yes, ma'am. You look terrible. Well, they began taking pony cart rides. And sometimes they'd go out on horseback. She was still young enough. They did this every day, rain or shine. year in and year out for several years. And when they went out in the afternoon around 3:30, he always took a flask of hot tea. Now, Victoria forbade the use of hard spirits in her households. You were not to drink liquor. And she would not allow anybody to smoke indoors. So the gentleman always had to go outside to do the smoking. Of course, Brown smoked like a chimney and drank like a fish, so that the flasks of hot tea were liberally laced with whiskey. And they would come back from these outings, the Queen radiant and glassy-eyed, and Brown staggering around. They had a great time. Yes, indeed. Well, she soon styled him my special personal servant, and he became the conduit through which the world went to get to the Queen. This virtually included all the ministers, all her family, the major servants, not her maids, but the major servants in the house, and of course he was very high-handed. He was not very tolerant with rank. It didn't mean much to him, or it seemed not. He was very brusque, even with the most elevated people. There was an occasion, for instance, when they were at Windsor still. The Prince of Wales had come up for a few days, and he was ready to go back to London. He didn't spend much time with his mother. They didn't get along. And she said to Brown, "Oh, ask the Prince if he'll stay over to luncheon. Will you, Brown? Go and ask him, please." So Brown stumped down the hall to the Prince's apartment, threw open the door without knocking, and shouted, "She wants you to lunch!" And there was another occasion. The Prime Minister this was Gladstone, not her favorite, who was coming, had to come up, have lunch with the Queen once a week. And the lunch table was maybe 15, 30 people. It was a large, always lunch group. And the Queen sat at the head of it. And she was a gracious person. Her manners were elegant. And she always included everybody. But you had to be spoken to. You did not initiate a conversation. You do not do that today either with the royal. You let them initiate the conversation, and then you can carry it on. But she would include everybody, and pretty soon she got around to Gladstone. She said, and Mr. Gladstone, how are the works going in London? And he began a long, protracted oration about the measurement. They were putting in this huge sewer system throughout London, all about the tiles and the pipes and on and on through the soup and the salad. Oh, she was bored silly, and she didn't want one damn word about it again. And her neck got red. This is what happened when she got mad. Brown stood behind her at meals, and he saw the red neck, and he knew the source of it. So he stumped around behind the Prime Minister and punched him. "You've said enough!" Well, he was rough with people, and people said he was rough with the Queen, too. Well, that depends. There was an occasion, I wasn't at this one. Windsor Park is closed off when the royals are in residence. The public can't go into all of it. And one day, I think there were two American women, as far as I remember, were in the park. They hadn't seen the barrier. They were wandering around enjoying it. And they went around a hedge, and here was a man throttling a little woman. Oh my God, she was writhing in agony, and he was killing her. They rushed up, policeman. Well, they found one. There was always some bobby around. "Please come, there's somebody being murdered." And he rushed in. Oh my God, what? "Oh heavens, ladies, come this way, out. It was the Queen and Brown. Well, what had happened? It was simple. They'd been out walking. The wind blew her bonnet off. And she put the bonnet on, but she couldn't tie it with her gloves on. "Oh, Brown, tie this for me. So he was trying, his big hands, and she was wiggling, and he apparently tickled her. And he said, "Ach, woman, hold still," and gave her a shake. This is when, So, now it's true. He spoke pretty straightforwardly to the Queen, but she knew that this was genuine affection, and it was. He never gained anything by being her special personal servant. He was married. He had a little house given to him by the family, the royal family. There was nothing to it. His will had nothing in it when he died. I mean, you know, it was nothing extraordinary. But it was a mutual dependency that they had. She understood his gruffness. She probably enjoyed it, considering everybody else deferring to her the way one has to do. And she had no equals. You see, everybody else was subordinate. But here was this man who had sort of penetrated the Byzantine etiquette and really meant what he seemed to feel for her. And he did mean it. And she appreciated it, I know. I think she enjoyed all of it. Well, as I say, this business of people trying to goad her into public appearances continued on through the 60s and up into the 70s. In 68, she gave in and she published her diary. She kept this diary all her life, and she started publishing volumes of it, you know, a 5-year period. She called it Leaves from My Journal. And she told everything. What Albert looked like in his underwear and how his muscles rippled. And her family were just crawling up the wall. Mother, you didn't put that in the diary. It's in the newspaper. Well, of course, this was the most popular coffee table book in England. Everybody bought Leaves from My Journal, and it was all there. Huge success. That was the year, by the way, that she met somebody who would have an enormous place in her life. And he was something of a phenomenon, generally. His name was Benjamin Disraeli. Now, the reason he was a phenomenon was that he was a Jew. Anti-Semitism was prevalent in England. Not to the point of outrages, no, but it was there. And it certainly was quite prevalent on the continent. I know in Germany, most of us were anti-Semites. And it wasn't that people were persecuting the Jews. It's just that there was that attitude. And Prince Albert certainly felt this. He had known about Disraeli because Disraeli had been in public life for quite a few years before he came to office as prime minister. It was this year, 68, that he did become prime minister. Now, Disraeli was unique in many ways. His father, Disraeli, a very prominent, well-to-do, scholarly Jew, knew that his children, Benjamin and Sarah, would have no chance at equity in the British society. They had money, you see, but they couldn't penetrate a lot of things. So he had them both, as they were babies and came along, christened in the Anglican Church and converted into, they were confirmed into the Anglican Church. So they were C of E, as everybody in the proper society was. And this gave them entree. Now with Sarah, bright, wonderful, very intelligent young woman, she, like most young women of the time, could not go to universities, but she was educated and accomplished. But Benjamin was the star of the family, and he shone. He was a spectacular student at the university. He was publishing in his 20s, novels at first, and then public issues were his books. His famous novel, Vivian Grey, was one of those favorite bestsellers. And he wrote on the issues of the day, social and political issues. He was very flamboyant, Disraeli was. And he got into government. He started out as a Whig and then went over to the Tory party and stayed there. And he was very much resented. Members of the House, he was elected to the House, and he rose in the Tory party. And eventually, to the point where he became leader of the party. And he was elected prime minister in February of 68. Well, when a new prime minister comes into office, he goes to kiss hands with the monarch. Not literally, but that was what you call it. And so he went up to Windsor to meet the Queen. Well, she was carrying on all of Albert's worst qualities, unfortunately. So she was looking at him as Albert did. How do you do? Well, Disraeli was an absolutely charming man. He was ingratiating, he was clever, he was witty, he was just a delight to be around. And the moment she allowed him to speak, he began a conversation. She said, yes, and I read your book, and all that sort of thing. And he said, oh, yes, and I read yours, Mom. We authors, Mom. Well, he was a famous author. And the Queen realized that he was equating herself with her little diary, with his long line of literature. Oh, Mr. Disraeli, please do sit down. Of course, after that, he was in. And he became, over the years, as Melbourne had been, she had some sort of a matronly crush on him and absolutely adored Disraeli as their relationship grew and depended on him and solicited his advice on government issues, even when he was out of power. And he was in and out with Gladstone all these years. She just adored Disraeli. But in November of that same year, the Liberals dumped the Tory party in an election, a by-election, and Gladstone did come in. Now, William Ewart Gladstone was just the opposite as far as the Queen was concerned. First of all, he was a competitor for Disraeli, whom she loved. So that killed him right there. But he was from Liverpool, which was not a very fashionable area. He was a man whose family had money. They were landed gentry. He was well educated, certainly. They were non-conforming religionists, somewhat puritanical. He was a lay preacher, Gladstone was. His confreres in the house thought of him as a moralizing didact. He was a little bit pompous and a little bit, everything was filled with biblical quotations, and this was annoying to a very secular society. So, but he was very good, and he had something of a social progressive attitude about him. He was called the People's William. Now, we might not think of him as very progressive today, but in the age we're talking about, he was. Interestingly enough, Gladstone, when he wasn't doing his work in the House, and certainly when he was Prime Minister, he spent his evenings tramping through places like Soho and Bow Bells, seeking out fallen women, whom he would induce to have them take him back to their cribs. They all had a crib, every prostitute had someplace. And there, he would get them to get down on their knees with him and pray for their soul's salvation. And it's true, that's what he did. There's never an inkling that anything else transpired. But in his doing this, of course, he became the butt of many jokes on the part of his enemies when they heard about it, of course. It didn't matter to him. He was totally sincere. He was going to save these women from sin and damnation if he could. Well, it takes everybody. The problem the Queen had with him, other than the fact that he was a competitor for her Disraeli, Gladstone was awkward with her. He was uncomfortable, and she didn't help. When he came to kiss hands, she didn't ask him to sit down and shake his hand. She addressed as few words as possible, and then he left. But on the occasions when he had to speak with her, he would talk to her over her head in a loud voice as if she were a public body. And this was terribly aggravating. She just was, everything about him aggravated the daylights out of her. So she simply detested him. And that's the way it went on for years between Disraeli and Gladstone. The Franco-Prussian War occurred in 1870-71. Victoria, with her German forebearers, was more sympathetic to Prussia. The King of Prussia was Wilhelm. His chancellor was Bismarck. And France offended the German states. They were none of them, there were all these German states. The French offended the Germans, some states. It was a political issue. They went across a border or something. And Prussia declared war on France and rounded up all the other German states to support him and invaded and conquered France. It was an overnight affair. I tell you, the French were absolutely gassed. And at the end of 71, there was Chancellor Bismarck holding the hand of Wilhelm in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, proclaiming the German Empire and Wilhelm the Emperor of Germany. That meant all the German states and duchies and principalities and kingdoms were united now for the first time in history. And Wilhelm was the Kaiser. Well, that was interesting because that made Victoria's daughter, she had a daughter, Victoria, remember, her first child, who had married Wilhelm I's son. So Victoria's son-in-law was going to be the next emperor. Friedrich was his name. And that was nice. Victoria liked these arrangements. Well, they were very close. All these family people were very hot on relations, very important. At any rate, while she was over there, she went over for some visit or other. Bismarck had a meeting with Queen Victoria, and after the meeting he said, that is a woman I can really deal with. She knows what to do. So apparently she and he got along famously, and she didn't back down to him a bit. In December of that same year, something really horrendous happened in the family. In the middle of December, the Prince of Wales, Bertie, fell ill. This was 1871, December. The doctors said he has typhoid fever. It was exactly a decade to the day that Albert had been taken away, and now her son was dying of typhoid fever. Well, Victoria was just in a fit state to be tied. Fortunately, the prince survived. His fever broke, and he was on his way to recovery. But she was very shaken by this. Albert all over again. That was December, and so within a month and a half, he was on his feet again, and she ordered a celebration at St. Paul's Cathedral, and the whole royal family and everybody marched up the steps of the great cathedral, and the whole of London was there to see them. This is one of her public appearances, and of course they were celebrating her as much as they were the prince's recovery. A couple of years later, England declared India a colony. India? Yes, the whole damned thing was a colony now of Great Britain. And England became, through an act of parliament, empire. Officially an empire. And Victoria was its empress. Oh, she loved that empress. Oh, Mr. Disraeli, how good of you. Yes, he had engineered the whole thing. He was always pressing for that. But Disraeli, a couple of years later, he retired from government. She had created him Lord Beaconsfield, and constant in touch and all of that. He was a widower now. He'd married up with a lady with money, and she had passed away, and so he was alone, and Victoria was very attentive. But in 1881, Disraeli was dying. He was in his late 70s. He wasn't very old. And Victoria was constantly sending over flowers and fruit and all of this. And in the last days, she knew, because she kept in touch, she sent messages, would Lord Beaconsfield like her to come and see him before the end? And he sent back the message through his servants. Please thank Her Majesty, but no. She would only want me to take a message to Albert. Disraeli had been a great promoter of England's empire. He had been one of the architects of the Suez Canal acquisition, if you will. British colonies were forming right and left as a result of imperial activity. He supported a strong monarchy. The Tories were all behind the monarchy. They didn't want to see it diminished in any way. But now that Disraeli was gone, she had to confront Gladstone, who was still in power. She may have been a dedicated imperialist, but he was the very opposite. Now, Gladstone, prime minister, had to buck his own government. You see this happening today, in case you hadn't noticed. You're following British politics or not? The Labour Party backbenchers are opposing the prime minister, as the Labour Party's in power. And there's a great deal of conflict. Well, this was happening to Gladstone as well. His backbenchers and the opposition party, the Tories, were all in favor of imperial activities. And Gladstone was opposing him. The Zulu War in 79 in Africa, I'm talking about all about Africa now. Gladstone didn't like that. He opposed it, but they overrode him, and England got into that. The Afghan War, the same thing. You know how that's going today in 1880. It never ends, does it? Men never learn anything, do they, Colonel? Well, the first Boer War in 1881, that was the beginning of a terrible disaster, and the British got into that in over their heads that early. He opposed all of it, and he was overridden on all of it. Well, in 1882, there was the last attempt to kill Queen Victoria. There had been 6 assassination attempts on Victoria's life. And I remember the one. I don't remember it was the last one, the one just before in 72, but she was going in to dedicate a hospital. She went up some little steps. There were gentlemen and courtiers on both sides. And she went into the foyer, and somebody reached over in front of her gentleman with a walking stick and brained her, laid her out flat on the floor. Well, of course, there was, well, fortunately, she wore this tightly woven lace cap all the time, and the cane was deflected by the cap. It didn't do her any real damage, but it sort of knocked her cuckoo. When they got her on her feet, she said, well, I'm sure I'll be all right. A little bit of water, and pretty soon she was off and going, but it was scary. The first attempt was in 1840. They'd just gotten married. The next one was the next year, 41, 2 of them in 41. Albert was in the carriage with her. I remember there was one time somebody shot at her, and he threw himself on top of her. No knives or bullets or stones ever reached her except the walking stick, but, you know, that happened. Well, there was more bad news in the early 80s. John Brown died. Now, he died of cirrhosis of the liver, in case you wondered. Well, the family thought this was going to carry off Mama. She would not survive this, but survive she did. Brown had been very difficult in the last year or 2 of his life. He'd become quite irrational. Of course, the drink didn't help, but he'd become paranoid about the Queen's safety, and it was very, very difficult. The household had a terrible time with him, and she was very solicitous. He could do no wrong. It was awkward all around. But recovered from his death, she did. And then her uncle Leopold, my God, is he still around? Yes, he was nearly 100. Yes, Uncle Leopold died, and that was the last of her parents' generation. And I think that's probably a turning point in everybody's life when you realize there's nobody of your parents' generation left. You're sort of alone on the desert island then. And I'm sure this is how she must have felt. Well, the next year there was one of these public incidents, and it had to do with Africa, and it had to do with politics, and it had to do with Gladstone. The British were busy in Egypt. There'd been a popular uprising against them, and a whole army had been wiped out by the Mahdi. The Mahdi was like bin Laden today, if you want to make a parallel. Very popular leader. And this whole army had been wiped out. And so the British Parliament was in an uproar to send troops in and just murder all the Egyptians. You know how that works when they try these things. Somebody said, well, let's send in General Gordon. He'll know how to deal with it. Well, General Gordon was one of these pain-in-the-ass heroes who the British still celebrate him. They think he's wonderful. He was sort of a cosmonaut of his time. He was a hero of the Chinese invasion of 1860 and a big blowhard. You pick your own today, you've got them still. Of course, all the dunderheads thought he was wonderful. Dunderheads like dunderheads. Parliament, they had to have Gordon go in. Gladstone was firmly against it. He knew this would be a bad idea. So he said, well, he's only going there to check things out. That's our expression. Well, Gordon went. He got officers supporting him. They brought in troops. They took Khartoum, which is a big city on the Nile, and they were, while they were going to plan their attack on the Mahdi. Well, the Mahdi's army was right over the sand dunes, and they came down on Khartoum and did away with all of the British, put 17 spears right through General Gordon. And it was, of course, the London Times blew it up. It was an atrocity. It was a calamity. Gladstone was blamed for not supporting Gordon. And the Queen sent Gladstone a harsh telegram saying, in effect, you are not patriotic. Golly, that sounds familiar. Well, anyway, that was not a happy business. But in '87, she did have a wonderful time because that was her Golden Jubilee year, and the whole world turned out to celebrate her 50 years as queen and empress. She had a glorious time for weeks and weeks and weeks over that. But the next year, Emperor Wilhelm I died. That meant that Victoria's son-in-law, Friedrich, Crown Prince Friedrich, would become emperor. But he was dying of throat cancer. He died, and Queen Victoria went to Germany for the obsequies of Wilhelm and for her son-in-law, and to comfort her daughter. She was there for 2 or 3 months, I think it was. Well, during the summer and fall of that year, while she was out of town, London was being terrorized by Jack the Ripper. This was the Ripper murders. Now, down in 1970, a man named Thomas Stowell published an article in a British magazine which included the diaries of Dr. William Gull. Dr. William Gull was, back in the 1880s, a student of criminal pathology. It wasn't a science then, but he was practicing. Very prominent doctor, Dr. Gull. And he had good relations with the head of Scotland Yard. So Scotland Yard would give Gull, at his clinic, the criminal murderers, the people they caught, for him to study. And Gull kept very careful records of all of his studies in his diaries. Well, Dr. Gull was also physician in ordinary to the royal family because of his prominence. And one of the people that he treated was Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, the son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the heir to the throne, known in the family as Prince Eddie. Prince Eddie was a rather difficult individual. As a child, physically he was fine looking, and as a young man he was very handsome, very fit looking. But he was ineducable. Teachers could get nowhere with him. This was pretty frightening when he was the heir to the throne. When they were in their teens, he and his brother George were sent around the world for a cruise to, firm them up. And then, of course, Eddie came back with a clap. Eddie's proclivity was sexual. He liked sex, and it didn't matter the gender or the station of his object. His cousins, his footman, his niece, whatever, it doesn't matter. He just liked sex. And he was very available. And once in London, he was arrested along with everybody else in a male brothel. Very embarrassing. He was a very difficult child for his parents to deal with. And they put him in the 10th Hussars to make a man of him, and he looked wonderful in his uniform. But that didn't go very far. They had to doctor up his degrees so he could get through Cambridge. That was a disaster. But he was very tractable, very pleasant, very amenable, very friendly, as I've indicated. Now, Dr. Gull kept a careful record of Prince Eddie. When Thomas Stowell, in our century, began to compare these diaries and look at them, interestingly enough, here was a diary on Jack the Ripper. Well, according to the Yard, they'd never captured him. It was not a closed case, I should say. They never said anything about capturing him. It was not a closed case. But here was a whole record about him. So evidently, according to Gull, they had captured him. and he'd been giving him to study. And he was now Stoll was comparing all of this. And the two studies were identical, according to Stoll. Well, nothing indicates any violent nature in Prince Eddie. And in 1891, he was betrothed to Princess May of Teck. But a few months later, before the wedding in February of 92, he fell ill and died, officially of pneumonia. But everybody at home said, oh no, it was tertiary syphilis, we know. Whatever the case, and I should say Princess May went on to marry George, the younger brother, and became George V, and Queen Mary with the toque thing. Well, if Prince Eddie had been Jack the Ripper, well, at least it would have been a great skeleton to have in your closet, wouldn't it? In 1892, in the summer, Gladstone was back in power. The Liberals were in power again, and he was a friend of the Prince of Wales and Princess of Wales. They liked him, they liked each other, and Gladstone tried to induce the prince to get his mother to abdicate. Of course, that soured her even further on Gladstone. She just, what are you doing? But by 93, after 61 years in public office and trying time and time again to get home rule for Ireland and always failing, Gladstone left office after his party was defeated and resigned from government, went into retirement. She wouldn't even shake hands with him when he went up to give his official greeting on the retirement. He died a few years later at the age of 90. Now we come to somebody who was also very important to the era. His name was Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. He was Irish, of course, a brilliant young student, did magnificently in his studies, both in Dublin and then in Oxford. He was publishing as a young man in his 20s. He was quite the rage. He gathered a society of young men around him. They all were very eccentric in their dress, and they had long hair and wore old-fashioned clothes and smoked hashish. Well, anyway, they were considered eccentric. And he toured America, lecturing and all of this when he was in his late 20s. And then he published his famous novel, Picture of Dorian Gray, when he was in late 30s. That made quite a scandal, and everybody read that. That was the time when he met Lord Alfred Douglas. Douglas was barely 20. Wilde was now almost 40. Wilde was married, Constance, and they had 2 sons. Wilde had had homosexual relationships, a handful, with young men his own station and age. Douglas was much younger and totally captivated Wilde. Douglas was the son of the Marquis of Queensberry, the younger son. Marquis of Queensberry was a hugely wealthy man who governed sports regulation, horse racing and boxing and such. Everybody loathed him. He was a loathsome man. But he was so rich and so powerful that everybody put up with him. He didn't like his younger son, Alfred Douglas, and they did not get on at all. And Queensberry was furious when he heard about the relationship between Wilde and his son. Wilde was putting one play, he didn't put them on, but they were put on for him. His plays, Lady Windermere's Fan, came out in '92 and made a huge success. Wilde was invited everywhere, every country house for the weekend, all the houses in London. He was lionized by all society. Everybody wanted Wilde. He was witty and charming and fun and everything, and everywhere Wilde went, now Douglas went too. You just included him in the house party. Well, in '95, he had just produced The Importance of Being Earnest, his most famous play. It was the height of his fame. And Queensberry was determined to break this relationship. So we went out to Wilde's club. Every gentleman belonged to a club, men's club. Queensberry handed over his card, Marquis of Queensberry, Esquire, so on and so on, with something written on the back to the porter. Well, usually you hand it over to the manager if you're leaving a card. The porter took it and looked at it. Oh my God, on the back he'd written. He rushed to the manager, handed it to the manager. Manager, oh my God, asked Mr. Wilde to come in immediately. Well, when Wilde came in, he was asked to come in, the manager, please sit down, Mr. Wilde, and he handed him the card. Wilde looked at it and said, oh my God. To Oscar Wilde posing as a sodomite. Well, the sodomy laws were very harsh in England at this time. Wilde left the club, never went back. He was induced by Alfred Douglas to sue the Marquis of Queensberry. The suit, of course, meant that Queensberry could gather evidence. Alfred Douglas had introduced Wilde to rough trade, street boys. These were brought in by Queensberry, and of course Wilde's lawyers dropped the case. Then Queensberry turned around and sued Wilde for sodomy, and he was convicted. And he was sentenced to Reading jail for 2 years, hard labor, and of course this ruined him. He had spent all his money, he'd asked for help from all of his fashionable friends. They couldn't remember his name. Mr. Who? Oscar? Oh, I don't think I know anybody named Oscar. All abandoned him. His wife left him. Everything was gone. In prison, his health was ruined. His mentality and mind was shattered. He published, as he left prison after that, De Profundis, a tragedy. You should read it. Sort of an apologia. He exiled himself to Paris. He couldn't do anything in England anymore. He was sick. He was lonely. He called himself Sebastian Melmoth. He published his last work, his greatest, The Ballad of Reading Jail, which was an expose of the horrors of imprisonment for anybody with, sensibilities. And it had some effect on prison reform. A couple of years later, at the age of 46, in 1900, he died. Now, the point of bringing him in here is that when you say, oh, you're so Victorian, what you're saying is you're such an hypocrite. All of the fashionable people who lionized Wilde abandoned him when he became a slight embarrassment to them. So it's hypocrisy that we want to figure here. In 1897, Victoria enjoyed her Diamond Jubilee, her apotheosis. It was everywhere. She was filmed. It was just marvelous. But then the glow went off in 99 when they got into the Boer War, which was a terrible disaster for England. And it made England as black a name on the world as a certain nation is today for some reason which we won't go into, and alienated England in the eyes of Europe. She couldn't go to France to visit. She decided to go to Ireland. And her family said, oh my God, they'll kill her. Well, officials were being murdered in London, in Ireland, British officials. No, she said, I'm going anyway. She went. She had a wonderful time. They loved her, nice little old lady. Nobody hit her on the head with a brick. She came back praising my dear Irish. Oh, loved her, had a wonderful time. But then at the end of 1900, she decided to go over to Osborne for Christmas. She wasn't feeling very well. And by the end of the month, feeling very poorly. As the year turned, she took to her bed. The family was summoned. She would never leave the Isle of Wight. In the middle of January, her favorite grandson was holding her in bed, at the head of the bed, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And the Prince of Wales came in, and Victoria said, Bertie, Bertie. And those were her last words. She died at 6:30 p.m. on the 22nd of January at the age of 82. Now, Queen Victoria was buried alongside dear Albert in the Frogmore Mausoleum, where they both are today. Victoria was honest, direct, loyal, generous, courageous to all. She gave her name to an age, but she was never a Victorian.